Hello guys and welcome to a new YouTube video. In this video, I will be tier ranking every MAK item from best to worst, and with me I have Metallfenix. So welcome Metal.
Yes, hello. I'm also here to do the item tier list, as it seems like I'm kind of the resident Mac guide guy at this point.
Yep. So we can start by explaining the tiers, and I'm going to zoom in a bit here. I think that should do it. So starting from the top, we have yes. These are amazing items that you are always happy to see. I think that is fair. Do you agree with this, Metal?
Yeah, and especially make sure you've read the patch notes. There are a few of ones that we will mention, which are in the tiers that they are, because the reworked catalyst is amazingly powerful.
Then we have
But I
strong in
think,
its context, which are items that you are also very happy to see, but you cannot just automatically put them on your board and expect them to, or they require, you know, a build or something to really pop off, essentially. But they are very strong in that context, essentially. So these items have the potential to be sometimes even more impactful than these, right? And then we have generically useful, which are items that might not be the most eye-catching or exciting items ever, but they're very useful very often. So, and strong. Then we have situational, and this is probably the hardest category to explain. So I'm gonna let Metal take this one. How would you define situational
yeah,
items?
so I would call these items where if you try to imagine the tier list as sort of like an exercise in visualizing boards, when it comes to the yes tier, those are items that are very easy to imagine on a very large range of boards. Generically useful is, stuff that you can slot in kind of everywhere. Situational to me is items where it's definitely possible to imagine the board where they are very strong, but that board might not necessarily be something that you would look at and think of as like, oh, this is a standard board or something that I do like every run. It's more like I can imagine the board, but it's not going to be the board that I'm playing most of my games.
Yes, and these items usually come with a lot of if statements or kind of they require things to be super strong. For example, some of these items really want enchants. Some of them want you to already have, for example, a lot of damage or a lot of regen or a specific opponent. So there are items that require a bit more love to be strong than the ones above them. And then we
And
have
bear with us too, because there are some like that might slip through the cracks with the changes. Like I'm looking at this now and I'm noticing that Tome is still in situational, even though we got
oh
the new
that one needs to
catalyst,
go.
which
No, I
it
think
probably goes
it's
all the way up to yes. Like
yes.
that is an
Okay.
insane item now.
Yes, I agree. Okay, then we have good early, and these are fairly easy to define. These are items you are very happy to buy on like the first 3 days. And some of them are even decent later, but their highest strength comes in the early game. And some of them are only played in the early game, such as the Friends here, which we buy for the XP node, for example. Uh,
Yeah. And
or
I think
others,
it's good to
gone.
point out too that like a few of them, like especially candles and magic carpet, are absolutely capable on being on 10 win boards, but they're usually items that you have the intention of most of the time pivoting out of, and if you get 10 wins with them, it's usually because you were win streaking through tempo.
And then we have niche, which is kind of like situational, but even more extreme. So what we use to describe these items, these are when they're the requirements needed or the times you find yourself actually playing them are even more rare or circumstantial. So these aren't necessarily items that are weak or bad. They just require a lot of setup or they just right now perhaps lack a bit of that support they need. Do you have anything to add here to niche metal?
Yeah, it's definitely like, items that you can still come up like I can come up with boards where scales are strong. I've had end game 10 win boards where I had like heavy scales in a femur build, but it's pretty obvious when you look at that board that the reason why um, scales was on it was because there were a list of like several things that you'd been intending to run that you just didn't hit. And they're the things that if situational are items that come with a few if statements, niche items are the one which come with a lot of if statements.
Yes, and I think another important distinction is that situational items are usually ones you're very happy to play or you want to play them. As in, if your build is going right, for example, you're playing Moostap, you're very happy to have Ritual Dagger, whereas niche is usually you were hoping to maybe play something else, but you never found that, so now you find yourself playing something you perhaps didn't intend. So there's kind of like a difference in how I look at the items from a am I happy to be in this spot, basically. And then we have no, which I think is perhaps the hardest category to explain, but it's just items me and Metal currently don't see the vision for. I'll let you try and elaborate a bit further, but
Yeah, it's just like if niche requires a lot of if statements for there to be a board that I could be convinced that I wanted to be playing. No is much more the items that, and for reagents especially, we're grading them from the active effect, not as reagents to transform necessarily. But it's items that it's hard for me to imagine a real board that I would actually play in a real match where I would put this on that board.
yes.
Um,
So let's then go through them, and we have agreed that the no category we won't spend too much time on, as these aren't items we recommend you usually play anyway. So we would rather focus on the items that we find
And
interesting and
mainly, of
useful.
course, since they're items that we don't see like a clear situation where you'd want to play them currently, they're also not items that we have actively tried to make work, which means
Yes.
that there's not that much we can confidently say on them.
No.
It's much more like when you
Speculation.
want to look at the game through our eyes, what we value and what we click in shops, these are items that we don't click in shops.
Yes. So let's go start with niche here. So we have Refractor, which I myself have sometimes bought in the early game if I fail to find better options, but I have never been happy playing this item. But I will agree, it is an early game item that has scaling on it, so there is a use case
Yeah.
for it.
I think Retractor and Runic Blade kind of go hand in hand in that MAK as a character have extremely limited venues of actual scaling. His items, generally speaking, in combat do not scale with only a few exceptions. Which I think means that if you are in the position in a position in the game where you're lacking damage, and you don't have pre-stacked region or relevant skills or ruby or emerald or stuff like that, and you just need something that makes you do damage, a scaling item can do that. And especially in the case of refractor when paired with runic potion, it can also provide you with a powerful like sustain option in some early mid game fights.
Yes, and then Thurible is just it has regen on it, it has burn on it. There are situations where you play a regen or a burn based build and you pick this up because those are the items you look for. But in a vacuum, this item isn't very stat efficient, so that's why it's down in niche instead of, for example, early. Um, then we have Runic Great Axe, which I have played, for example, when I'm playing Femur, and I have a Runic Potion, so I have life still on it somehow. I might play this if I have 3 board slots on the board where I lack good items, and then this effectively gives, or sorry, doubles the damage of my Femur, but it's not an item that is like a first-hand choice for me. It's a substitute for better items, but it has a niche case for me, and there are probably other cases where you play this. But that is an item that I think is niche. And Metal, whenever you feel like chiming in for an item, you can do so.
Yeah.
But I want to go on.
I think the biggest thing with crit on Mac is that we'll get to strength potion later. but it just always feels like even crit skills are such a dubious pickup on this character because you have so many items that either have guaranteed crits or that you give guaranteed crits with strength potion that it makes it much harder to fit like crit related items and skills into your build since you already have the best way of solving that.
Yes. Then we have this, what is it called? Cellar?
Seller, yeah.
I have personally never played this, but it is a reload item, and for that reason, it feels a role when you're lacking reload and you need reload. I don't think it's a good item, but
Yeah, it's
it
both
has a role.
seller and satchel when you have
Yes,
like, especially if you have the bottled lightning with um burn on it in the early game, and you just don't have the Tzidian dagger. You might be willing to just pick an item that says reload to make it so that you can use it, or even I think in the early game where fights are very slow, if you just have a bottled explosion with base damage, like that will kill people in like 20 seconds. And it's again the whole like scaling thing.
yes. And then Runic Longbow was buffed in the patch before this one. I haven't played it myself, but I know you Metal think it's a decent item now, or at least
Yeah,
it.
it's mainly just the fact that it's got multi-shot and lifesteal, and there are better ways to get that with small items in the aura buffing builds like Moustaff. But a lot of the time, if you're just missing a good weapon to pair with your Moustaff, a 6 second or whatever the cooldown of it actually is currently, multi strike lifesteal weapon is good if you buff the damage on it.
Then we have Poppyfield, which we both agree can be very powerful, but the items that supported this archetype, specifically floor spikes as well as spider maze, were heavily gutted. So the reason it's niche is that it's harder to find yourself wanting to pick up the items for it, as well as the fact that what we consider one of Mac's strongest items, we'll reveal that later, is kind of antithetical to Poppyfield. So you're kind of avoiding some of Mac's best items to play this, which I don't think is a optimal way to play Mac. But of course, it is still a strong build. And Metal, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, I will add, like, as a side note, that this is theoretical, but now that we have catalysts as a way to much more reliably roll for toxic, obsidian, and slow on small items, it's very possible that Poppyfield becomes something where you can reliably enough force a really powerful version of it that it shoots up in the tier list. But it's too early to say, and I would need someone to like play a lot of games with it to then convince me that it's actually a reliable strategy. Because the nicheness currently is not Poppyfield is weak, it's Poppyfield is hard to get into, so you're better off going for options that are much easier to hit while still being comparative in
Yes.
power.
And I think we don't need to talk too much about Spider Maze. We can jump right to Soul Ring, which I think you said it well. You just click this because it gives you 10 regen, right?
And I
That's
will say, like, I have sometimes nichely played it for the damage in the past, depending on how good Philosopher's Stone actually turns out to be now, because that item looks like it got a lot better. It's entirely possible this might move up to situational, because it only kicks in at 10 seconds.
yes.
But if you have like 200 burn on like single digit days, or 200 regen, I mean, um, having that turn into 200 poison at like 10 seconds is a very valid win condition. It kind of just remains to be seen just how big our Philosopher's Stone's gonna be, because they need to be really big to justify this item as a offensive choice.
Yes, and then we have Bottle Tornado, which is an item you only specifically play if you are in a build with a lot of sustain and disruption, but you lack a way to close out the game and you specifically want to counter slower scaling builds. In that specific niche scenario, it might be something that can help you in a pinch. However, there are always better ways of solving that problem with items that are higher up. But that's why it's
I
niche and not
think
no.
it's worth commenting on it that I could see a world in which it would be rated much higher if Burn was less powerful as a mechanic, because that's the main thing right now is that as a general rule of thumb, uh, Burn tends to overpower the vast majority of actual scaling builds, and on top of that, MAK specifically has access to some items or combinations of items that have genuine innate exponential scaling, which makes them even more strong in terms of overpowering scaling builds. And if those things weren't true, this is an item that would be much less niche because it would solve a
Yes.
problem that's harder to solve in that world.
And then we have that, which used to be much higher, but as a result of the flask nerf, we both believe that that is now far more niche because there is a much higher risk in clicking it. But
Yeah.
of course, this is still a bit speculative. This has been in the past a very powerful item. It could be that there are new ways of playing it that make it situational instead, that you simply. Uh, there,
Yeah.
so we don't know, but it's either
It's one of
here or
those
here.
where it's similar to Poppyfield, right? Where if you get the old VAT board together, it can still be really strong.
Yes.
And most VAT runs, I think you will still be able to hit either Boiling Flask, which is still good, or the Toy Vendor, which has high odds of showing the shipwreck.
Yes.
But or the tiny ship in a bottle, I think it's called.
Model ship.
Um,
Yeah.
Bottle ship, yes. But the thing that matters so much with that is that every turn you don't reliably find that payoff might be one more PvP that you lose, putting you further and further behind in momentum. And if you hit it too late and face, like the million scaled Pygmalion with Fixer Upper or something, you will lose and then the run is over. So for builds like that, the consistency of like getting the payoff is very directly correlated to how attractive the item is to pivot into to begin with. You want to be assured that if I buy this, it will pay off, not it might pay off.
Then we have scales, which you already covered earlier. It is an item that serves a purpose. There are just items that do that purpose more consistently or with less requirements. But it is an item that fulfills a niche. And namely, if you
Yeah.
have a powerful combo that you want to charge and you are able to exploit this item. And
I
then show.
think
Okay, go on. You
it's
can.
like very directly correlated to pendulum in that they do the same thing and one is better, which means that it's hard to put them in the same tier. Because if they
Yes.
do the same thing, you're going to be much likelier to go for the almost identical thing that does the same thing on average better.
Yes, and then Show Globe got very buffed. This is probably our most speculative placement because neither of us have really we haven't played with the new one and we cannot tell you exactly how a build would look like, but it got
Yeah, so
significantly
I
buffed.
can give like a theoretical one where it's like so they tripled the values on Show Globe, and it is a scaling item, which we already mentioned is something that Mac can have issues with. And now the Athanor is back to being like something that is fairly attractive to run because it gives you a steady supply of catalysts. So you might buy it as a catalyst generator that you can actually play on your board. Athanor means you're in a burn build that wants to play two quick firing potions that it can then reload. And Showglobe will scale when you fire off those potions. So it's probably not like plan A or plan B or even plan C, but if that's what you happen to be doing, there seems to be a clear argument that Showglobe, at least in theory, might fit on that board.
And I think so. Then we have Runic Blade, which I think is best to discuss in conjunction with Magic Carpet. But in
Yeah.
short, this solves a late game problem you might run into if you specifically are playing Magic Carpet for 10 wins. So for that reason, it fulfills a role. But what I will say from own experience is that this item is very hard to actually make work in practice, because the way it works in practice is that it's never the first hit that kills them, and it has a 12-second cooldown um, at gold. So that's 24
Yeah.
seconds before it deals a million damage. And then the upgrade makes it 10 seconds, which makes it even harder for the first hit to ever kill them. So I think it's a very awkward item, but it is one of few solutions to a real problem. And that's why it's niche
Yeah.
and
And
not
I
low.
think like if you have actual some way of having a reliable crit and you have like a shiny fang and a pendulum, this item can go insane. It's just that's the textbook definition of niche.
If you have a shiny fang and pendulum, you're probably winning anyway, is my addition to
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
So then we have good early, which is, we mentioned the definition earlier. So bottle lightning is a very efficient item. It's very flexible. You can use it with carpet, you can play it with potions, you can play it with burn. It's just a very nice, useful item. It's almost, not quite, but I would compare it almost to, I don't think Uzi is comparable, but like it is
I think
an
the
item
the
that is
main
wearing many
thing that
hats.
makes it so attractive is the fact that it double dips on skills.
That is also true.
So
Yes.
if you ever have just that with Tzidian Dagger and you have a burn skill, they've nerfed the burn skills, but a bronze burn skill can still easily put a flask, a ball of lightning to being like 10 or 8 burn, which is
Yes.
damage
And
early.
that is kind of why I started making an Uzi comparison, because Uzi with a good skill or a good buff can very much also just
Hmm.
solo the early game for you. And then we have Magic Carpet, which is as we mentioned earlier, a very strong and solid build overall. But you're most happy to play this in the early game. You aren't happy to grab this on day 5 or 6. Like it's an item you probably picked early, and if you're still playing it on day 10, it's probably because you never found a way out of it. It's not necessarily an item you want to play forever, and that's uh, what this category means. And then we also have, can you pronounce this one, please?
Ouroboros statue.
Yes, I'm gonna call it statue. It's, if you don't know, it's whenever you poison, you gain a bit of regen. I think it's 2 base, and
Yeah.
then it goes higher. It's just items that say whenever you do X do Y are usually inherently at least semi decent, and
And especially considering that it also poisons itself, which means that, it is one of the things that
yes,
charges. And on top of that, it means that it's a freeze target and all of that stuff. The region actually goes 2, 6, and 10, which makes it very powerful at gold,
yes,
noteworthily.
it is a good upgrade target if you have nothing else for that reason. And then we have
Yeah.
Quill and Ink, which is a very efficient, especially on day 1. It has a steep requirement. You cannot play any weapons on your board, so that rules out Bottle Lightning and a few other good items. But especially on day 1, it's very easy to fulfill this requirement, and then it's one of the best small day 1 items. I find that this is one of the first items I end up selling, because there are so many um, weapons I do enjoy running that it's sometimes hard to keep this around forever. But there are probably builds that have this on their board far longer than just in the early game. And
And
Metal,
I'll
what do you have to
also
say?
say that, like, it goes so much stronger at silver than at bronze, because even though it only goes from 1 to 2 with multicast, I've noticed that there is a early game breakpoint around 3 or 4 regen where items that hit those numbers spiral out of control immensely fast on the first 3 days. So it's one of
Yeah,
the, like, I think it's the only Mac item except for Sword Cane, which is in the same category, that's capable of getting 4 regen per hit at silver.
I think
Most
you are
items
correct.
are limited to 2
There's also
or
Philosopher's
even
Stone,
best case
actually.
3.
You
Yeah,
can do,
Philosopher's Stone we'll talk about later, but
sure.
it's in its tier
Yes,
for a reason.
yes. Then we have Sulfur, which isn't in a vacuum a good item, but because Burn Mac is so strong and this happens to be a burn small item, it is just good early. It's not great early, but
Yeah.
I play this all the time, and I'm not mad about
It's one
it.
of those things where you can see the ruby is coming up in generically useful. It's a very
Yes,
powerful item. If you have a better fiery, like if you have the equivalent of gold fiery on a bronze item, turns out it makes it a lot better.
yes. Then we have Nightshade, I think it's called, and this is just
Yes,
a
correct.
decently. It does stuff basically. I don't think it's the
It
you know.
scales damn quick. Like
Yes,
in the mid game, like on the first, like even on day 4, day 5, Nightshade typically, I think even after the catalyst changes, should outperform Retort for a good bit. And it can even outperform Aludel if you don't have a poison skill.
yeah,
And then it falls off a cliff because you're playing a slow charging poison item. But within that narrow niche of very good early, it has some of the most aggressive scaling that I've seen on an early game
yes.
item.
Then we have Mirror, another that benefits tremendously from a silver upgrade. It goes from 1 regen to 3, I believe, and as Metal mentioned
Yeah.
earlier, regen is very good when it's not 1. Like you get it a bit higher
Yes.
and it does
Hmm.
stuff. And then in general, it's a decent transform target because regen is one, or sorry, not regen, restorative is one of those effects that often get 10x. So if it's a burn or a poison item you roll into, those numbers can get silly very fast.
Yeah.
And then we have candles, which is microdave on steroids, except it's not a friend. Um, and
It's
yeah,
awful
it's
friendly looking though.
yeah, that's true. It's just it's microdave on steroids. It's very good early. I have never
Yeah,
played it for
and
10 wins though.
the best thing about it is that it's so almost unconditional because there are a lot of the reagents that we'll talk about later, like Obsidian Shard and Mothmeal, are just fast on their own. It's
Yes,
so easy on Mac. Like you have that, you have a Fang, you have a letter opener. These are just things that are inherently fast, and that means that it's very easy to enable candles almost no matter what you're doing.
yes. And then we have the three friends. We buy these specifically, but not only for the XP node. Uh,
Actually, I'm
okay, go on.
going to disagree there. I think all three friends on Mac are also strong on the board in the early game.
No, but I said
Um,
specifically, but not only. Like that is, I agree
oh
with
yeah,
you. Yeah, yeah.
I okay,
I'm just
yes,
ranking them
misheard
here
you.
in order of how
Hmm.
strong they are. So this one, I am not like this is just a very decent item. It's kind of just a bit of regen, a
Yeah,
bit of poison. This one has higher highs. In fact, I would probably say that fireflies, if
I
you
think
also have
like
slow,
I'm more likely to run Venomander just because it goes on like
more
it
boards.
doesn't need anything specific if you get it to silver.
Yes,
Like paying 1 extra gold in the long run to get an item that says 2 regen every six
that's fair.
seconds is solid.
We talked earlier about how hard it is for Mac to find scaling, and so why Fireflies can
Yeah.
sometimes be underrated. It got buffed earlier in a different patch, but it's
Hmm.
it's actually it just relies on the more slow you have in the early game, the more this gets out of hand. But it's not always easy to have a lot of slow. That's why it's a
I
bit less
think
consistent.
one of the most specific noteworthy things about Firefly too is when you have Calcinator or Candles and you're trying to get over that threshold of actually stacking burn, just having an item that scales to then apply, like, even if it's only 10, even if it's only 15 at like 7 seconds, the fact that it gets you over the scaling threshold and then you can keep it up, it's very helpful in those fights where you might not have like a ruby yet or something like that.
Yes, and then leeches I think is overall the most lackluster. It is very inefficient in its both in its size and scaling, but it has
Yeah.
lifesteal. It does technically scale. Um, it has won me a few fights against Rogue Scrapper, but this is
Yeah.
one of the quickest. This is probably my. If you look at when I buy an
It's
item
the
and how
one
soon
you're
after I
like
sell it.
least inclined to run, but I
Yes.
have also beaten early game weapon Vanessa boards that lacked scaling by just
Yes.
out life stealing them with that boy.
to me, this is just sometimes it does stuff, but most of the time you
Yeah,
just buy
it's
it for
very
XP.
vaguely playable.
Then we have letter opener, which is just a very clean, efficient item that is super duper strong with magic carpet.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I very rarely run it with unless I have strength. I don't tend to run it without magic carpet, but it is also true that for like if I prefer like Tzidian Dagger Bottle Lightning if I'm trying to double dip on like a left-handed, but if you happen to have only right-handed, for example, you can't easily get more ammo on the Bottle Lightning. A lot of the time, Letter Opener will still crit twice, if not three times, with just a little bit of luck.
yes.
Um, it can double dip on skills.
Then we have Emerald, which is a very good item for poison builds. The problem is that poison builds aren't very good, but it is the ruby for the poison builds, and especially
Mhm.
early, I think it's very good. This is just a very solid, strong area of effect,
I
essentially.
also do think it moves up to situational whenever Poppy Fields is a build that feels compelling to run. Because it works really well with Poppy Field and with Venom.
Sure.
Those are just not things that I'm super excited about running currently, which really hinders. Basically, the only actually good poison multi-strike items, the Aludel and the Quill and Ink, are things that are tough to run on your board later in the game, which makes it tough to run Emerald on your board later in the
Yes.
game.
And then we have Fire Potion, which, for a similar, albeit slightly different reason to Fireflies, which Metal outlined, I think is very solid because what Metal said
Yeah.
is when you're running Calcinator or Candles, it's very important to try and get over that threshold where you start scale burn or stack burn, and that is true
Hmm.
for Fireflies. But sometimes you don't have to stack burn indefinitely. Sometimes you just need that
Yeah.
one match, that's one spark that lights a bonfire, and then even if that bonfire dies out, the opponent dies first. And this frequently is that match. So it because it's 5 seconds and these are between like about 6 seconds in practice or 5 seconds, the burn goes off at about the same time. Meaning you
Hmm.
stack maybe 20 burn within 2 seconds, and that 20 burn, even if it eventually will go down and down and down, it never quite goes down before the opponent dies. So it's it is in a vacuum a very inefficient item because there's one ammo and on its own it does nothing. But because Burn Mac is so good and he has so many other good burn items, I think this is a very good item early. But it's
It's
one of the first to
also
be removed.
I was gonna point out before they changed Boiling Flask, we had especially Bottle Lightning higher. Now, like because if you multicast them, especially if you reroll Sulfur into a fiery fire potion and then you multicast that, it is legitimately kind of strong. But now that's a lot harder to do because you can't even find it at silver anymore, so it's probably not a real line. However, we'll get to Athanor later. It got a lot more compelling to buy just to run on your board for a little bit now that it gives a catalyst. And Fire Potion is maybe the single best potion to pair with Athanor because it's both quick and has burn, which also kind of raises its stocks. Probably
Good
not out
point.
of like good early, because that's still when you're trying to do that, but it's really good at doing that.
Then we have Sword Game, which is probably the weakest of the good early game options, but it
Yeah.
solves a few problems. Just it is just something you sometimes buy.
I
Honestly,
think
it
it
might be
no,
here.
it
Honestly,
goes in good early, but
okay,
it has one really annoying caveat,
okay,
which is that the item is middling at bronze and really good at silver, which means that if you find yourself in a line where you had no choice but to run Sword Cane, a lot of the time you have to spend an upgrade on it, which is very expensive. That's why we're like picking it rather begrudgingly. But if you do that, it's 4 regen on a 5-second cooldown that can also burn and poison at the same time. It
yes.
becomes really good we're just unhappy about having to upgrade a medium to silver that we don't want to keep long term.
Yes. Now we move on to situational, and first and foremost we have Vitality Potion, which
Mhm.
I personally have never used on a winning board, so I'll let Metallfenix defend or explain this item.
Yeah, so I think one half is obviously everyone knows about Enchanted Multicast Vitality Potion. But I think that is a niche line. If that was the only thing I cared about Vitality Potion for, I would have put it in niche. The reason I consider it situational is because one half of its use is that. The other half of its use is that in the late mid game, where you'd usually find that while having a substantial health pool, MAK lacks compelling defensive options if you are not already on like Runic Potion or have a very high amount of regen. I've noticed that a lot of the time, if I'm doing like Calcinator or I'm doing Femur but I didn't find Runic or I'm doing Moose Staff and I have like 100 regen rather than 700 regen. You live long enough that you can get off a 13-second cooldown, and then you'll oftentimes heal for 4, 5,000. So it's just the fact that when that goes off, it can genuinely be a game-winning like amount of healing, and it's also really easy to just get a hold of Gunner or the potion ammo equivalent, where it just has that 2 base ammo. And especially if you're running that with some kind of wide haste, like you have your energy potion, it's very possible that in a 15-second fight, because the first one kept you alive for even longer, you get to have the second one go off. And now it's like temp boost on mega steroids, where it gave you an additional health bar. And it's in situational because my plan A typically wants to be I'm gonna make sure I kill you so fast that that isn't even relevant. But as a plan B, I have 2 health bars. It's kind of a good plan.
That makes sense. And then we have another second health bar kind of a situation with
Mhm.
Invincibility Potion, which is probably um I don't know how to say. I think it's not that good at gold, but at diamond I can see the vision. Because for context,
Uh,
I don't play this that often myself.
yeah, it's like at um, Diamond, I consider it strong in its context. It also got like even better now because when it comes to potions, there's kind of two variations of the potion board with distillery where you can either run multiple small potions or you can run less potions but with a boiling flask and to have the boiling flask like enhance some of what you're doing. And when that was the most prominent build because it was so easy to find boiling flask at silver like relatively, that is one where it is usually tough to fit invincibility potion, especially at gold, because it doesn't multicast well. So you'd have to not run that on the boiling flask, and then you end up in this awkward spot where there are just other potions that you'd rather run a lot of the time. But when you have it with distillery and haste potion, even at gold, a lot of the time, like the uptime can end up being like if you bring down the cooldown to 7 seconds with the diamond distillery, and then you have it hasted, it shields you for 1 second every 3.5 seconds, which means that 1/3 of the time you're not taking damage on top of the guaranteed proc at half health. And that's usually how I look at invincibility potion is that when it comes to trying to be defensive, one of the most awkward things is the fact that you don't always know if your defenses will line up well with what the opponent is doing. Maybe you're shielding and they're poisoning. Maybe you were trying to scale and they were trying to burn. Maybe you're playing Vitality Potion, but they're a one-shot build. Like, there are a lot of awkward scenarios. But in terms of just broad reach, having something that says 1/3 of the time I simply do not take damage from any source, that then upgrades into saying half of the time I'm immune to damage, if not more, if you start charging it with like labs or something, or you have library or whatever. There are niche scenarios. That becomes something that you can say rather broadly tends to have uses, because not taking damage 1/3 of the time oftentimes just means dying 33% slower, which is kind of relevant.
Or okay, and then we have Pendulum, which I am. The more I play Mac, the more weary I grow of this item because I see the potential and I see the strength, but in practice, you really want it to be diamond, and then you also need to have a board where you're willing to sacrifice two board slots. So it is for that reason situational. We used to have this probably up in strong in its context, but I think that it is quite narrow, but when you finally find the situation, it is very powerful. An example is I played quite a bit on femur boards where I started chain reaction between my highest proccing slow item and either the femur itself or another fast procker, and that kind of is my engine for the femur then. So there are other use cases as well, I think. So Metal, could you
Yeah,
explain
I
where do
think
you
the
find uses for
main
it?
issue with Pendulum is that it's a 2-slot non-active item, whereas
Yes.
Library is a 3-slot non-active item, and Distillery is also a 3-slot non-active item. Which means that in two of the two items that it is competing with are the items that are Mac's probably most potent ways of solving late game acceleration. And that's what kind of makes it situational, is because I treat it as a hedge against the possibility that I won't find the library. A lot of the time I'm happy, in fact, to buy a gold pendulum when I'm coming up on my upgrade, and sometimes even upgrading it and then not playing it at all because I found library. Because if I find library, I'm happy because I have library. And if I
Yeah.
end up having to field the pendulum, then I'm still happy because it meant that at least I had the pendulum instead of not having anything that solved that issue.
So Scales is outclassed by Pendulum, which is
Hmm.
outclassed by Library. That is how the ladder goes
Yep,
here.
that's exactly it.
Then we have Tasidian Dagger, which is I mainly use this for the what's this one called? The Bottle Lightning.
Yeah,
Um,
it's definitely by far the best early, but I have
honestly,
noticed no, so it
okay.
is in situational just because the one situation where you can use it some amount of the time is Mac has a lot of ways of getting enchanted potions, especially with both like the alembic and the distillery, which means that there's a real possibility that you have a potion with an enchant, but you don't have an ammo skill, and you might not have one of the potion support items yet.
Fair enough.
And I think the main thing is that if in niche we had two medium silver start reload items, Cellar and Satchel, whereas Tzidian Dagger is a small bronze item that rarely needs to be higher than bronze, or at least like silver, and you generally set because you're not expecting to use the thing more than 3 times in a fight.
I will
Which
also add.
means that
No, go on. Sorry.
it's just an item that's the easiest way by far of solving ammo consistently, but you don't always need to solve ammo, which is what makes it situational.
What I was going to add is it also has really annoying practical anti-synergy with Runic Potion, which I have discovered
Yeah.
many times that if I'm playing Staff of the Moose, I'm playing Femur, I'm playing a good weapon, I'm playing even Magic Carpet, I put this on the board and and usually with runic potion you only have like maybe 2 ammo or 3 ammo, but you really want the first proc to land on your carry item. So
I
there have
will
been
say
time.
though,
No, go on.
I do actually think a lot of the time in moves that you mentioned, I'm
Mhm.
not nearly as unhappy about the Zidian Dagger because it's relatively quick at
Fair
six
enough.
seconds. I think it's much worse in like something like Femur or
Carpet.
like in Carpet, it's usually fine too because you tend to run the Mortal and Pestle to
Yes,
begin with.
I'm talking about where you have this as your. Sometimes you don't find this one basically, and then you have to run this as a
Yeah.
substitute.
So
But yeah,
there are some scenarios where it's bad with Runic, and there are some scenarios where it's surprisingly okay with Runic, but it's still
yeah.
distinctly
Then
situational.
we have Basilisk Fang, which is an item that you're happy to play both with Staff of the Moose and with Poppyfield. So it's quite a flexible. It's a fast, small weapon essentially. So
Mhm.
and then it also has
With
crit chance.
lifesteal and
Yes, with
crit,
lifesteal.
yeah.
Yes, it's just it has uses, but it those uses aren't. It's just a semi-useful
The
item.
one thing that kind of makes it situational is basically just the fact that
The
you
rarity, right?
find it at a point in the game where weapons are starting to get tougher to play. Whereas
Yes.
if it started on like silver, it would be very generically useful.
Yes, I agree. It's the
Um,
rarity. That is,
yeah.
if it started earlier, it would be higher here for sure. Then we have Venom, which I think is a. It honestly, I don't know
It's
because
somewhere
this is
right in between situational and niche. The reason I think it's fine in situational is because it's not that hard to end up just playing something like Fang, Emerald, and then like um I mean Venom with Fang and Emerald, or like Emerald and Obsidian Shard, or and now this line has become more niche due to Poppyfield being less attractive. But if you're ever picking up a poison skill because you're hedging one of the builds that scale well with poison, or you had like the Aludel or what have you, um, this lets you keep playing that poison skill for much longer if you ended up in a board that runs weapons like Moose instead. Um, and it also has good synergy with if you just happen to find the skill toxic. I find that that's a really nice way of bridging the gap for the Mustaff board when you don't have like perfect regen stacking yet.
yeah, agreed. Then we have Ritual Dagger, which goes mostly in one and one build only, and that is of course Staff of the Moose. It is very powerful in that build, um, but it's situational because it's that build, right? It's
And it's especially also the fact where I think Ritual Dagger is very strong in Staff of the Moose, but I have won games with Moose Staff where I didn't find Ritual Dagger, so I don't consider it like an essential component, which means that it's now not one of the like necessary pieces of that build, especially now that Philosopher's Stone is even stronger. Um, but it's also only good in that build, and on top of that, it's hard to find, which just means that yes, when you are fully committed to no staff, you'll probably try to dig for Ritual Dagger as best as you can because it is very good if you hit it. But that's still something I would consider like it's not. Yeah, it's situational.
Then we have earrings, which I had a game today on stream where I got heavy earrings on Femur, and I can tell you that that item goes hard with enchants. So
Yeah.
it's an item that when it works, it's almost up. It can be up here, but most
Mm.
of the time when you see it, you pass on it because it has to the stars have to align for this to be super good. It also
It's
has
kind of
great
the
synergy with
exact
Pendulum.
same thing as the like ritual dagger, right? Where the if statements are just a little bit narrow. If
Yes.
you have this with smelling salts and incense and pendulum, it's good. If you have this but with a specific enchant or
Yes.
specific skills, it's good. Like that's what we put in situational, things that have a lot of if statements.
Yes. And then we have Sleeping Potion, which is one of the fastest slow items MAK has. It's 4
Yeah.
seconds. And because we have some items we'll get to later that really, really reward you for having slow procs, this is kind of boosted a bit. Like, if you just look at the item on its own, it looks kind of middling, but in
Hmm.
practice, it feels, in a lot of situations, it is useful. But it's not generically useful because I would never play this, if I didn't have any other slow synergy, right? What do
Yeah,
you want to add
and
here?
I think also the other use case scenario for it that's worth mentioning is if you have explosive potions and you have like a distillery. The fact that it is so fast means that it can be a way of like rapid fire charging your vitality potion, or if you have it with multicast or like a lot of ammo, it can work as a pendulum trigger. But all of these scenarios are like not the average board. It's more like, oh, I happen to stumble upon a situation where I need something that meets these specific requirements, and I also have whatever support that the sleeping potion needs to work. It can really like it can be the best item on your board practically, but
Yeah.
I it only happens sometimes.
And then we have Thronet, which is a very powerful item with Femur. However, you don't play this against every opponent because it scales its multicast uh, depending on how many weapons and or friends your opponent has on their board. So against certain opponents, it will only be like maybe 2 multicast or 3, whereas against others it can be upwards to 8 or 9. And for that reason, and for the fact that it's mainly used only with Femur, and it's not like an essential part of that build, while very powerful and of, oftentimes even game winning on its own, it is still by definition situational, I think. And I think you
Yeah, and
agree.
it's especially like I think in a world where the other slow items were much less attractive, especially like incense, it might be an item that we need more often, or vice versa. If we had a lot more slow payoffs, it might be more generically useful than it is now. But it's just one of those things where even if I'm playing Themer, if I see it, I'm gonna be like, you know what, sure, let's pick that up and let's slot it in against specific boards. But I'm never thinking to myself, well, I hope I'm not typically thinking to myself, okay, the thing we absolutely need to look for now is throwing that because that's really gonna make our build pop, you know?
Yes, and then we have Sunlight Spear, which did get nerfed at bronze. It's now 11 seconds instead of 10. Or sorry, not bronze, silver. And this is used specifically in conjunction with items we'll get to later. So it's a bit of a weird item in that regard. It's like a third wheel, or whatever you want to call it. It's a support item where you use
Mhm.
it for its secondary effect almost. You don't care about this actually going off. You use it to boost a different item, which is why it's very situational, even if it can be
Basically, you
powerful.
just the only thing you can really reliably use it with is if you have a charged Philosopher's Stone or a ton of regen from your tome, but you don't necessarily have a highly stacked Calcinator, but you do have a Fire Claw with a Strength Potion. It's an incredible item to put on your board because it basically turns into a super buffer for your Fire Claw, which converts regen into burn at an item that has nearly half the cooldown and lines up perfectly with Strength Potion.
Yes.
But of course, as always with situational items, those were a lot of if statements.
Then we have a freeze package here. We have both the Frost Potion and the Sapphire, which are items that have won me games in this combination, but I don't think they are ever. I'm never playing for freeze on Mac. I think that is
I was
inherently.
like, I
Gone.
was tempted to move Frost Potion up before they nerfed Flask because I thought that like with Silver Flask that didn't increase the cooldowns, a lot of the time, like you could even like a silver frost potion kind of froze for a lot, but it still felt like you still relied on having the boiling flask. And now where the boiling flask is not only harder to find, but considerably worse for that type of strategy, it definitely makes it feel much more like to justify frost potion, you need to have something specific like, oh, I'm on a library build and have sapphire, or oh, I'm on a distillery build and it gets a million ammo and low cooldown, like stuff like
Honestly,
that,
the more we
which
talk
makes
here,
it
the more I feel like this
situational.
has to be correct because it's now a gold starting item as well.
No, so the
You don't?
thing
Okay,
is,
okay.
like,
We'll get to that
I
later.
think I think in terms of like build payoff, and I might turn out to be wrong about this, mind you,
Okay,
but I still feel like it's easy to hedge for the things that are good with boiling flask. Because I think freeze potion, vitality potion, and bottled explosion, if you are already angling towards potions and maybe you have a distillery, a lot of the time they're not. They are things that have low opportunity cost to keep around because they're already adjacent to what you're doing. And a lot of the time, when I found a late game boiling flask, it would probably be at um, gold already and stuff like that. So I still
okay.
feel like when you hit it, you can make really strong builds with it. And notably, especially the vitality potion stuff, but I think also if you have like self-charging bottled explosions, or you have a way to like you play like distillery with frost potion and stuff like that, the increased cooldown becomes much less detrimental, especially because the distillery reduces that by, like 30% if you have it maxed out.
Yes, and then we already covered this one kind of by talking about the way you use it with this one, etc. So we can jump right to laboratory, which got buffed. This used to be down here when we first made the list. Me and
Mhm.
Metal both agreed that yes, you can sometimes use this as a bronze battery to charge your VAT or your juiced up calc to go off a second earlier or two at diamond. But in practice, that is a lot of if
And I
statements.
will point out that I do think if you already have Diamond Library, Diamond Lab makes your build the strongest in the game to the point where it's something I will actively look for. But the thing is, you have to not only find library, but then after you've found the library, you have to find a second large gold item, which did inherently make it niche because it's just hard to do that thing, even
Yes.
if when you do that thing, it's insanely powerful.
Anyway, the reason it moved out to situational is because it now provides you with catalysts.
Yeah.
So the reason you might look here, oh, but these items higher also do that. Yes, but these are silver or bronze starting items, whereas this one you won't find on day 4, and when you find it, it costs 24 gold. And if you
Mhm.
haven't found a catalyst generator yet, likely you don't have an infinite money printing machine, so it can be difficult for you to, if you specifically buy the lab not for the thing we described earlier, the niche use case, but only to print your catalysts. That's very expensive to do. That's why we think it's probably situational over generically
Mhm.
useful.
Because it's very like the if statements in this context is if you still lack a catalyst generator and if you have sufficient funds to purchase one that's golden large, you buy the labs. But that's harder, especially compared to the ones that are not only lower starting rarity, but smaller on top of being lower starting rarity.
Yes. And then we have generically useful, which are, as we talked about earlier, perhaps not the most flashy or exciting items ever, but these are items we almost always or usually buy or can easily fit on boards. Uh,
Mhm.
and it just they aren't. the opportunity cost or the initial investment is very low versus the
Mhm.
reward. So first of all, we have Obsidian Shard, which I think we can both agree is the of the ones you can find the smack in shops is the best reagent overall because it has so many use cases. So Metal, I'll let you
Yeah,
talk about this one
it's
for a bit.
both the fact that um, lifesteal is very powerful if you can pair it with any of the damage boosting skills, but it's also a small, quick lifesteal weapon, which for one makes it very easy to slot onto. For example, Mustache boards as a payoff for the damage aura. But another thing that I actually think is super relevant is the fact that it has such amazing synergy with Runic Potion because it lets you, if you're transitioning into a femur build, for example, and you have Runic Potion, I never put another weapon on my board because even if my Runic Potion has multiple charges, missing just the first one can be such a crippling amount of healing that you lost out on that it can lose you fights. But the exception to that rule is items that already have lifesteal, because not only do they get skipped over by the runic potion, they also get free haste, which just means that there are so many scenarios where both early but also into the mid game and sometimes even on your final board, you might still be running an obsidian shard.
Yes, and then we have Ruby, which is a fiery skill on a stick, on a small stick specifically. It's extremely, extremely powerful, arguably one of the strongest small bronze items in the early game. And then even the upgrades aren't that bad. It's you can think of it like upgrading a good burn skill. So I have frequently had games where I have 9 wins in the bag and I'm still rocking a gold ruby on the board. That's why it's not just good early, but generically useful. Because on burn builds, I'm more than happy to have a flex spot open for a ruby. It doesn't it still is semi-useful later on. Of course,
Yeah,
eventually,
I think the main thing is I would put it in good early if we were in a world where Fireclaw didn't exist. And just because of how Strength Potion lines up with Fireclaw, making Fireclaw a fairly attractive option, oftentimes even into the later days, and then the fact that Fireclaw effectively double dips on Ruby just means that due to that sequence of factors, it's much more realistic to find situations far later in the game where you're still willing to put that on your board than
I
you
agree.
would something like Emerald.
And
And
then we
again,
have
it's like why I mentioned why Emerald could move up if Poppyfill was
yes.
way better.
Then we have moth meal, which is serving a lot of purposes. So first and foremost, it's a fast item. It's 5 seconds and it slows. So if you want to scale your firefly early, this is an excellent slow item for that. It is a
Hmm.
reagent that transforms into heavy, and we discussed earlier that some, for example, the restorative enchant was pretty good. Yeah, heavy on Mac is in freaking incredible. There are some high rolls like the aforementioned heavy earrings, but even a heavy incense, there are pretty much this reagent you're very happy to transform because the average outcome is fairly decent or sometimes game-breakingly good. Uh, and then above all, it's just an item that easily slots into one of Mac's strongest builds currently, which I think is Femur. Um, I
And I also
sometimes,
think
yeah, go on,
it's
go on.
like noteworthy too that it's on. So, Sleeping Potion is more niche because you need to have ammo if you want to use it as an incense replacement. Oftentimes, you use it as a fast first trigger. However, especially if you have like a lower tier incense, if you have a high tier smelling salt, you only need like Mothmeal can basically be better than incense in some niche scenarios,
Yes,
but even in the worst of scenarios, that means that if you just don't find your incense, a lot of the time Mothmeal is a replacement for sure. Like it's not overall better than incense, but it's not a replacement that you're like terribly unhappy about playing, since it might just be hey, now I have a fast item that slows for a reasonable amount, and on top of that triggers my smelling salts.
Yes. I will grab some more water, but Metal, I'll let you talk about perhaps these two or however long it
Yeah,
takes in the
yeah, I'll
meantime.
I'll go through those. So I think amber is very similar. Amber is never your first choice for a slow item, but a lot of the time, if you already have smelling salts incense on your board and you have a free slot to run amber to buff up that incense, it's decently attractive. It's definitely, and the main reason why it counts as sort of generically useful is due to the fact that if amber is just one rarity above incense, oftentimes outside of hardly working, it's equivalent or better than the incense, which means that since the if statement is, like you have to have it one rarity higher, that's not like super niche. It's not that hard to be in spots where you have a silver incense and a gold amber, and then you might totally run the gold amber. So that's pretty generically useful. The next one, the Algudel, the poison multicast item, used to be in good early, but now it also gives catalysts, which means that since it's a bronze starting medium item that generates catalysts, that's something you'll oftentimes be on the lookout for buying. Um, it's the same thing with Sifter. Like Sifter is just the exact same thing. It's lower starting tier and smaller size, which makes it better. And then finally, the apothecary is kind of the same. It generates a reagent or a catalyst, and oftentimes you might be able to make both of those work. It could potentially move down to situational because it's not a guaranteed reagent, but that's why it's there.
I'm back here,
Um,
so
yeah.
you
I
covered
think
generically useful.
on Strongest context, I can also mention briefly that Athanor is the same thing, but it has two key differences. It's not just a guaranteed catalyst. I do think that Athanor is a decently competent playable item even in the mid game if you ever happen to be on some kind of like Ruby Fire Flask board. Which means that I consider it out of the um, like, it's more playable than any of the catalyst generators that we've placed below it, but it's still far less playable than the catalyst generators we've placed above it, if that makes sense.
Yes, and then we have Boiling Flask, which got nerfed in the patch.
hmm
So could you? I think we already spoke about it actually, so maybe we just
Yeah, so
briefly
my
cover
main
it.
argument with Boiling Flask is that the thing that makes it still strong in its content in context instead of moving all the way down to niche is the fact that the build that wants boiling flask the most is oftentimes, like wide potions or distillery, and those builds are already going to be hedged towards getting boiling flask to the point where if you get it early, it was better, but if you get it late, when you do get it, it's still as strong. But the reason why I rate that much lower is because I think that relied on Boiling Flask being a consistent payoff, whereas when it comes to doing things with Potion, a lot of the time, especially if you have an ammo skill, you can also do potions with Library. You can even do it with the Tzidian Dagger because you don't care about the dagger's cooldown. You can do them with the Distillery, and you can do them with the Boiling Flask, or now even maybe in some niche scenarios with the Athanor, which means that the archetype as a whole isn't as reliant on Boiling Flask, but it's still one of the best things to use with that archetype, if that
Then
makes
we have
sense.
Incense, which we kind of disagree here. I think it's up here, but I will allow it to be here because I do agree that on its own in a vacuum, especially at bronze, it is not a very impressive item. It needs upgrades
Yeah.
and it wants smelling salts as well. But I think
I think
we can
like
put it
as
here.
soon as like the only thing you need to do to make it an absolutely amazing item is just find slow up from Curio. Like if you
Yes.
do that, it's amazing. A lot of the time you can run it with Amber, but I find that Amber is something that I don't always find, and that's tougher to find space for. Which
Yes.
means that I think out of all of the items in Strong in its context, smelling salts is the one that goes, or I mean, incense is the one that goes on the most boards. Like it's really easy to find slots for it, but it's also an item that a lot of the time I'm willing to cut. Like there have been boards where I removed incense to put in sleeping potion because all I cared about was getting my smelling salts activated as fast as possible, and that's what sleeping
Sure.
potion does.
Then we have Energy Potion, which is, I think, very mediocre at silver. At gold, it's good though. And then if you get it anywhere higher or you get cooldown reduction or ammo on it, it becomes extremely strong because Mac struggles with finding ways to permanently haste his board. So this solves one of his main conundrums. The only reason it's not up here is because, again, at silver, when you find it, it is since the nerfs, because this has been nerfed multiple times, it no longer self hastes, it no longer it starts at 6 seconds instead of 5 or 4. So it has been
Yeah,
heavily
it's like
nerfed.
it's Mac's only way of solving wide haste in class, which is incredibly valuable, but you have to jump through hoops to make it work, which is
Yes.
very similar to like it's incense except with more hoops. And I think those items where it's like this is amazing, but you have to jump through these hoops for it to work, kind of belong in this
And then we
category.
have Runic Potion, which gives one of your weapons lifesteal and hastes your lifesteal weapons for 1 second. And this is strong in its context because it is far from a potion you play in every Mac build. In fact, you could argue that the strongest Mac builds currently wouldn't even run it. However, in the right circumstances, whether it be a staff build, a femur build, some kind of other weapon-based build that has high damage, it's of course really powerful because lifesteal
Yeah.
is a very powerful enchant, and it also opens up different synergies that there are, for example, some max skills that care about lifesteal. There are some monster skills that care
Mhm.
about it. So, and
It's not
also,
something you slam like every game. I think the main thing with it is, of course, that not all Mac builds even run a weapon to begin with.
yes.
That's like the main thing that makes it.
Another thing of note is that it's also extremely, or just lifesteal in general on good weapons, is a sure way of beating practically every PvE encounter in the game. If
Hmm.
you have a lifesteal carpet or a lifesteal femur or a moose, you can beat Lich, you can beat Infernal, you can beat Scoville, you can beat almost every boss except probably Frost Reach Champion and
Yeah.
maybe the what is it called, Void Golem. I think those are the two exceptions, but everything else, you pop a runic potion, you're probably fine. So that's
Hmm.
part of its appeal as well. All right, then we have Hourglass, which is an item that is the context matters. Like this is probably the
Yeah.
most contextually important item on the list because if you just look at it, especially bronze, it is not good. However,
Hmm.
the way Mac functions and the way the game currently works is you love playing an item that is called Strength Potion, which we'll get later, and it turns out that a lot of the targets for this item have the same cooldown, and this item gives your items temporary crit chance, rather 100% crit chance. So when that happens simultaneously with the items you want to give crit to, they
Yeah.
don't apply that on the first hit. So if you can find any way to get this below 6 seconds, you basically effectively double your damage on the first volley of the game, which is extremely strong. And Hourglass is currently Mac's most consistent, cheapest, and easiest way of achieving that.
I
Then
would
in okay, go
argue
on.
like second most consistent and cheapest and easiest because it is noteworthy that smelling salts with either moth meal or sleeping potion also achieve the same result with an item that you much more generically want to always be buying.
Yes, but that is still a two item combo to achieve the same thing. This is a how should I put it? This is a easier way to do it, even if smelling salts is a more ideal way to do it, perhaps, if that makes sense.
It's
But I
more just
agree.
like what I mean kind of is that smelling salts is something that's much easier to just like already have, and on top of that, both the smelling salts and the moth meal or sleeping potion will be actively applying slow triggers, which is relevant too, just for like,
That is fair.
you know,
I will
actual
add though
slowing.
that I often have these hand in hand because what this sometimes
Yeah,
can allow you to do is allow you to instead put the haste on the your weapon source, and then this hourglass allows you to manipulate the timings so that you can still haste your best item, but your strength potion still pops. So there
yeah.
are
So
neat
I
tricks here.
do think deserves its placement because the spots where it lands, it's very similar. It's got similar vibes to me to Runic Potion, where it's like you need a really specific circumstance, but when you just go like, oh, this is exactly where Hourglass goes, and you put Hourglass there, you just go like, oh, that felt so good.
Yes. And then we have Staff of the Moves, which I know I got some pushback for putting this highly. I know a lot of you watching will probably argue that Poppyfield is far stronger, or you think Poppyfield is far better than Staff. So Metal, could you perhaps help
Yeah.
defend this item?
So the main thing for me that I think people underestimate when it comes to Staff of the Moose is that they think it needs Philosopher's Stone or um, the Ritual Dagger or even like just you to have been doing tome shenanigans to win games. I had a game where all I had was Staff of the Moose, and then I pressed like 3 regen events, and then that got me to like 60 regen. And now Staff of the Moose boosted the damage of my entire board by like 60. And in the mid game, I utilized that with the fact that it has multicast and 200 base damage to just beat people down in a very mid range fashion. And then in that particular game, since I never found a ritual dagger, instead I translated that into an explosive potion build, where that's actually one way of getting your explosive potion way higher base damage than you expect it to be able to get under a lot of normal circumstances. And you can end up doing similar things with we mentioned the runic blade isn't really the thing that we're looking to do, but if you have Staff of the Moose with letter openers, and the runic blade starts at like 100 damage, suddenly it's stacking, far, far more aggressively to the point where on the first swing, if you have 3 separate things that's doubling it, you can easily get it to the high thousands. And it's just that general sense of like when you have a reliable means of achieving a wide aura damage buff on an item that in and of itself hits hard and reliably and also carries some defense, it's not the best item in the game, and it's definitely a bit of like a jack of all trades type item, but it's not an item that's in the typical spot where it also feels like it's a master of none, because it does all these different things somewhat competently to the point where I've never had Staff of the Moose and thought to myself, damn, I couldn't figure out anything to do with it.
I would
And
also
that's
add,
why I think it's kind of strong. Yeah.
unlike Poppyfield, it kind of just kills people when you buy it. I have bought this
Yeah.
on day 2 with 0 regen, 0 weapons,
hmm
0 nothing. This just kind of kills a Mac, it kills a
It hits for
dually.
400 at 10
Yes.
seconds. Like, that's a
So
big
there is
number.
no opportunity. Well, the cost is literal. It's 12 gold. That is the cost. But if you can
And,
afford it,
like,
there
don't
is no.
underestimate, like, before, I think a lot of people might not be familiar. At 13 seconds, the way the numbers line up, you have to have ammo on a strength potion to get it to crit with the staff, and it's kind of annoying. But now, if you just have a bronze hourglass and a gold strength potion, if you put the bronze hourglass on the staff of the moose and you run a gold strength potion just normally, even with no other factors involved whatsoever, that Staff of the Moose is going to be hitting for 800.
Yes. So this item I think is sometimes hard to evaluate because it doesn't look that exciting. It looks intimidating. It looks much harder to make work than it actually is in practice, which is
Yeah, and
I
it's also
think the
like
thing.
Poppyfield has such narrow pairings, but I've run Staff of the Moose with Flamethrower from random encounters, with Proboscis from Curio, with random fangs that you had lying around, because it's just all of your things have more damage, that's so broad that you can find a lot of things that actually do things with that. The letter opener double dips on it with its crit. The bottle lightning double dips on it with its crit. The obsidian shard gets lifesteal for the whole value of whatever you're buffing your board. Like, it's just having a bunch of free damage on things does things. That's why strength is
Yes.
such a good
It
starting
is
skill.
also completely and utterly broken with caltrops. If you happen to discover that from a pig
Yes,
shop or you fight void golem, that's just
and
GG.
and coincidentally, I think most staff, and especially if you have that stacked like Philosopher's Stone, is one of the better boards at beating Void Golem, especially if you ever have Radiant on
Yes.
the move staff. But
So
even if you don't, like, you can beat that fight with that board.
then we have the current bad guy of well, he's the poster child
Yeah.
for MAK needs a nerf, and that is
Hmm.
the big bone, the femur. So femur is currently, while I think me and Metal both agree that Calc is the strongest
Yeah.
and probably best MAC build, femur is the one that catches the most flack because it's the most in your face. It's the most, oh, that is the item doing the
And
thing.
I
It's
think it's also like because there are calc you need to make work, and there are tons of ways to make it work, which is why it's good. But you still have to know those things and figure out those things and understand how you're supposed to stack it. And we'll see now that catalysts make that infinitely easier. Maybe people in general catch on to calc. But with femur, anyone can take one look at Mac and figure out Femur goes with Incense and Runic Potion, and even if those are like the only three, like if your board is just Femur, Incense, Salt, even if it's just half a board, 5 slots, those 3 items, that's gonna straight up beat a lot of boards in the mid game just due to how it works. So whenever you have something that's that straightforward to assemble in a somewhat competent manner, people will notice because the bone hit you in the face.
yes, and it is very powerful, and it is an item I always am happy to see, especially before level 7. It is on stream today without any intention. I ended up probably 7 out of 10 of my games ended up femur games, just because it is so easy to play femur, and
Yeah.
it is also very strong with good enchants. It scales nicely in the late game. It's just currently, oh, and not to mention that it has insanely good synergy with
Mhm.
library, which is we'll get to that later. But basically, femur is just very very strong in its context, and currently that context isn't even that difficult to achieve.
Yeah, and the big reason why I think it's so attractive to just slam femur is because it's a quintessential, like, it's the same way I feel about like flagship on Vanessa all the time. It's an item that I just know this probably gets me to 10. I don't think it's the strongest Mac build. I think the ceiling on even Moose Staff is way higher. Boiling Flask is a much higher ceiling, not to mention stuff like Calcinator and more niche builds. But the thing about Femur is that it's very easy to assemble, but it still probably gets you to 10. Very similar to also when like Railgun Dually was really strong.
Yes. All right, then we have Fireclaw, which is strong in its context because it very much wants or even requires you to play some kind of calcinator combo, or as we mentioned earlier, if you have a juiced up Philosopher's Stone with the Sunlight Spear. It is a
Or Ruby stuff as well.
yes. There are lots of ways to enable it, but by far the easiest and best is calc. Just have a big calc, and
Mhm.
then you have a big claw. And
And the
this
the
gone
only
gone.
reason I think it's correct to rate Fireclaw so highly is because, as we've mentioned and will continue to mention, the things that enable Fireclaw, Calcinator, Philosopher's Stone, and Ruby are three of the generically most powerful things to be doing on Mac at any given time in any given game, which means that the odds of you hedging into Fireclaw are really high. If the aforementioned things were kind of crappy or rare, you'd see Fireclaw plummet all the way down to as far as niche, because it's as good as how often you'd actually put it on your board. And right now, the correct answer to that is a lot of the time.
Yes, and then it also has a beautiful synergy with Strength Potion because
Hmm.
it is by default 7, unlike Calc, which is 6. So, if given that this is such a good item, this is also just a very reliable way to get that first double damage in. You don't need any fancy hourglass or smelling salt shenanigans. This on its own is just a I will kill you after 7 seconds. You have infinite burn on you. You will not, survive that. It's just a very reliable mid game slash early late game combo essentially. And then
And
we
it
have incense,
also
which we
is like, I think one more thing to note on
sure.
Fireclaw is that burn builds that don't have Fireclaw, and now I'm not talking about Calcinator builds, I'm talking about Ruby builds, oftentimes can suffer from the fact that Smelling Salts is one of Mac's best items, but they don't actually typically have something on their board that's good to haste, because Ruby builds rely on going wide with a bunch of small burn items that oftentimes also have ammo. So the fact that Fireclaw condenses all of that into one, and then you can double that with haste instead of doubling it with strength potion, or do both, why not? Um, that's very powerful to give Ruby a way to utilize smelling salts.
Yes, and then we already covered this. We're going to jump right into the tomb, which is much stronger now that it's so much
Yeah.
easier to transform. And
I
pre
think the
gone.
biggest thing with Tome is when Mac first came out, before we had a lot of the builds figured out, a lot of the time I'd put my level 7 upgrade on Tome if I ever found it early. And I noticed really quickly that, all you needed was like two transforms for it to be really good. Because 20 region base start is not only very strong, but it also is enough to, like, now your move staff is like already quite online, because it means the move staff aura equates to a gold strength already. Um, Now, if you can potentially transform twice or thrice a day, it's no exaggeration to imagine that you might be gaining 30 or more region per day without actually needing to find distillery. So I think that changed it from being something that you can buy and upgrade if you have nothing else going on, and it's kind of like a niche hedge towards Mustaf, to instead being something where you just slam by that every time you see it, because you can know for a fact that with how many things generate transforms now, you will be able to get 20 or 30 region a day, and that so quickly becomes ridiculous.
Yes. And then we have Mortar and Pestle, which got buffed. It now gives you, I believe, at the start of every day, a
Yes, a
catalyst.
catalyst.
Yes, and it was already almost, it was between good early and generically useful item. So now it's just
Yeah.
a very good item got even better. And when good items get even better, they usually end up almost broken. That is how the Bazaar has
Yeah,
worked in the
it's very
past.
like, it would be fair to place it in generically useful too, but in this case, I thought it very nicely demonstrated how, between the things that generate catalysts, lab is large and gold, so it's tougher to get. and then it's a little bit easier to get the 3 in generically useful, but they're not as attractive to play on your board outside of like very early for the Aludel. Athanor is a little bit trickier to get, but it's still okay to put on your board. And then finally, we only have one item that generates catalysts. Well, okay, we have two. It's this one and Philosopher's Stone are the two items that generate catalysts that you're oftentimes happy to put on your board, which means that the opportunity cost you paid to have that long-term catalyst payoff is 0.
Yes. Then we have, oh, what is this one called? Is it the Aludel?
It's called the.
I always
Always
get this
forget.
one mixed up.
Somehow I always. It's the retort.
Oh, the retort, yes. So the
Yes, this is the
retort is
retort.
the poison equivalent for calc. And this used to be probably down, I don't know, in somewhere
We
here,
placed it
probably.
in generically useful
Okay,
because
okay,
you
interesting.
would only buy it for money, but you would buy
Yes,
it for money.
yes, exactly.
And
It
the
generates
big
you leads.
reason why is, I think, the thing you have to explain about poison versus burn is that outside of in the early game, if burn is stacking, generally speaking, you can expect burn to be twice as good as poison. And
Yes,
this means that for a poison item to be a valid plan A or even plan B for you to go with, you have to expect that the item in question, when upgraded and invested into, has to be capable of generating twice as much output as you would expect from like a burn carry item, right? Which previously, yes, if you found distillery and all of the upgrades, you could do that, but that wasn't something that you'd consider like, because it wasn't a reliable plan A, you didn't want to force retort. You usually wanted to try to look as hard as you could for the calcinator, because that was the only one of the two worth investing in. At this point, I almost wouldn't be surprised that if you just like find this one, you just commit to it because it might just be like good enough. You know what I mean?
I agree. I can see this either being still generically useful, or yes, it just depends on
It's
how
definitely
strong
still
it is as a
yes.
win
It's just a
condition.
question of like,
Okay,
because now it's so much guaranteed money, like regardless. It might
okay,
not be something we always play on our board, but it's so much money
that's
now.
true. Yes, it is kind of like a schematics, but much better, essentially. And
Yeah.
schematics is a very good dual item.
Like if
So,
you just have that and the Mortal and Pestle next to it, you already know that that's guaranteed that for the price of 8 gold and your level 4 upgrade, you will have plus 10 gold, plus like 12 gold every day.
yes.
Which
And
is a lot of
then
gold.
we have smelling salts, which we have kind of discussed throughout this entire list because they are very much an item that kind of Mac is warped around because this is one of his premier ways of giving an item haste. So we discussed how this item is the only way for him to give full board haste. Well, this is his best way of giving targeted haste to one item, and the way it functions is that it's very easy to get that haste to be looping.
Yeah,
So,
I think
Metal,
like,
explain why
correct me if
smelling
I'm
salt is so
wrong,
good.
but right now I would genuinely consider smelling salt to, if you're just looking to perma haste one item as soon as possible and permanently, I don't think there's a better item that does that than smelling salt in the entire game on any class.
Metronome
It's
is better.
like, yeah, like metronome is like comparable, but I think metronome has oftentimes like is a lot more upgrade hungry and harder to find, whereas
Okay, I
this one
will
is
clarify
like,
it. Metronome is only comparable because drill is drill. If that is it's build context dependent, but in a
right, yeah, yeah.
vacuum,
So
yeah,
so
so
in
it's
terms of
because of
like
drill.
just being like generic,
Sure.
like if we're just looking at like how good is this at making sure that you're getting
Yes, I
haste,
agree.
it's insane.
Yes, that is
Like
true.
captain's wheel is considered kind of like the gold standard for the longest time in terms of being like really really good. And Captain's Wheel currently is not even entirely full uptime at gold as a medium item. Whereas I've like, if you have incense, you can easily get this to loop at silver, and even if you don't, like Mothmeal smelling salts is already a like permanent haze loop at like gold.
Sure. Yes, it is extremely strong, extremely efficient. If you have rust, for example, or anything that
Yeah.
keeps you slow immediately, it is
Clamor.
game-breakingly good. Yes. So just an extremely strong item. Then we have
And
strength
especially
potion.
because
Okay.
like even more noteworthy, this strength potion will tie into this too, but Mac has a play style that's really focused around boosting, like putting all of your eggs in one basket. You make
Yes.
one thing really strong in a very similar vein to like single weapon Vanessa specifically is a lot of the time how Mac builds feel. And when you're making one thing really strong, um, haste and crit double that thing where is the basket you've placed all of your eggs in, it becomes exponentially more powerful to multiply that the better the one thing is.
Indeed. And then we have Strength Potion, which gives all your items, and yes, all your items, 100% crit chance for between 3 to, I believe it's 5 seconds at
5,
diamond.
yeah.
Yes, which is just a. When I made my Mac item review with Snacer, I called this as probably one of his most broken items. I also said it was probably one of my favorite items that I was looking forward to play.
Yeah.
I was correct on both fronts. I was horribly wrong. We don't talk about these, but I basically most of my Mac predictions were way off. I thought the runic package would be super strong, but strength potion specifically, I was spot on because as a force field enjoyer, as a dually realizing that crit chance kills them twice as fast enjoyer, as strength potion is, it's deadly enchant times 2 on all your weapons or all your items for a time that is long enough to kill the opponent. So
And I
just
think the big thing too is that a lot of the time Mac really lacks right now other compelling means of stacking crit. They removed the
yes,
crit from Pendulum. It feels pretty bad to play the Palanquin. He doesn't have like, any skills that are on the level of Inorexable. He doesn't have anything that's like Vanessa's Amulet or Crow's Nest. So you end up in this scenario where, well, if there's if it's really obnoxious for me to get any kind of consistent levels of crit, then I should probably always just hedge for going for strength potion. I think it could be anywhere from strong in its context to downright situational, depending on how good other ways Mac had of making sure that he got his crit. But since he has like effectively no other compelling way of getting crit, and strength potion is so easy to enable, why wouldn't you?
I would say even if you could get crit from other means, the fact that it's straight out of the gate 100% is all that alone just makes all other crits irrelevant. Because if I wanted to balance this item, which I don't want because I love it, it should be 50% at silver and then 75% at gold and
Honestly, though,
100% at diamond.
I would hate that. I think they
Yes,
should
I
look at the rarity
no
or
no
the duration
I
because
I
you
agree. From a
don't want to
player
make
perspective,
it
it's bad.
RNG. It would be
No no,
so
I
frustrating.
agree it would be frustrating, but it would balance it and make crit
I think it would
because
make it unplayable. I would never
okay, fair enough.
ever put it on my board. Like if it said 90, I would be reluctant to put it on my
Yeah,
board
but my
because
point is
yeah.
when you describe Mac can solve crit elsewhere theoretically, no, he would never be able to get 100% crit chance in the early game reliably because even with like slow and steady or whatever, or no slow targets, it still takes time to ramp up the crit. The reason this
Yeah,
is
so
so
that's kind of what
busted,
I mean though, is what happens with Vanessa a lot of the time is she has items that let you get flat to like 40% or something.
yeah,
And then it's very easy to get one or two skills that then add on to that to where you solve it within seconds to the point where you can solve it faster than strength potion would actually go off. But the thing that relies on is for those things that bring the base number to begin with to be sufficiently compelling because you probably can't make it go from 0 to 100 fast enough. But if you only need to go from 60 to 100, it's relatively easy.
sure. Then we have this one, like alembic. No,
That one is the alembic, I believe.
how do you pronounce it? Alembic,
Let's
yes.
see, alembic. Yes, that is the
So
alembic. The reason that one is in yes tier now is because, like, buckle in and listen closely. They didn't make it just give a catalyst instead of a reagent when you buy it. It currently reads, at the start of each day, transform the small item to the left of this into a random potion and get a catalyst. When you buy this, get a small reagent. This single-handedly gives you a guaranteed 2 transforms a day, which I think for a silver plus medium item, that is insanity.
yes, I agree. It could be Mac's strongest item. We'll have to see a bit in practice if it actually
It's one of those where,
plays
like,
the
right,
way it
like,
says.
if you find a distillery is way better still, but this one before was something that I was very feeling very begrudgingly about when I had to play it instead of the distillery because the gap between them was so wide. But a
Yes,
lot of the time, like, when I use a distillery, the theoretical how many theoretical shops can you find in a day? Like, if you go every shop, but it's like 5, right?
5, I think, or
Yeah,
four,
but a
four or
lot of
five.
the time, like, realistically, I didn't go to 5 shops because you don't need to commit that hard to transforming
No, no,
unless
wait.
you're,
I think
like,
it's 4
digging
actually. It's
for
2 before the fight and then 2 after. So it's 4, right?
Isn't it 3 after? It's 6 nodes in a day, and one of them is the fight,
No, but one of the notes is
I think.
also the player fight, right? Or am I
Oh, yes,
tripping?
it might be 4
Yes,
then. Yeah,
I think
sure.
it's 4.
Um, in any case, the main point is, before on distillery, a lot of the time, I'm not necessarily transforming more than, like, I can do 3, sometimes I do 4, but a lot of the time I just do 3. And the
Yes,
gap between 1 and 3 and 2 and 3 is like night and day.
agreed. So yeah, this is a very strong item now. And then speaking of strong items, we have library,
Mhm.
which I cannot believe dodged a nerf. I was
It's
so
insanity.
certain, given the fact that they, nerfed robotics factory. I think they nerfed.
Mhm.
Did they nerf shipwreck as well? I don't remember.
Yeah, same
Yes,
change for shipwreck.
this is basically Max robotics factory, except it's also Max chrono barrier in the same item. So somehow
And I
it's
think the
still
craziest
alive.
thing about it, like, it's not even max like shipwreck or anything. The thing that's so insane about it to me is that you have to understand how cooldown reduction is calculated, which is every other source of cooldown reduction in the game, bar like diamond scrap or like the diamond core upgrade thing on Dooley, like very niche scenarios. Um, all of the loot and skills that reduce cooldowns typically do so by a percentage. And what this leads to is constant diminishing returns where you're always infinitely approaching 0, but you'll never reach 0. And obviously, you also won't reach 0 because it's hard capped at 1 in the Bazaar. Look at like Alaro. But the thing is, the point is, the more CDR you put on a thing, the harder it gets to reduce the cooldown further. But the aura from library, because it's an aura, has to apply last to calculate properly. Which means that if you take the library out of your board and you reduce your incense with, just like put a 10% reduction on that, it's going to be down to 5.4. When you apply the library, it now goes down to 3.4, which is something that would have, if it was a percentage change, you would only have gotten like half that value out of all of the loot. So cooldown reduction is already one of the strongest things in the game. And library just flat out says this character benefits way more from every source of cooldown reduction than any other character in the game. And I think that's so fundamentally, like, that's the only thing Mac does right now that I truly consider broken. because that is an exception against the rules of the game, you are not supposed to be allowed to abuse cooldown reduction like that
Yes.
because it leads to like I've had a 2.3-second incense. That's a 6-second base
And so
item. You're
that's the
not supposed to
theory.
do that.
Like, just in theory, it's dangerous game design. It is extremely potent, but in practice, especially with the current best Mac builds, and this isn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily it's a egg or chicken or the egg situation, but basically for different reasons, but albeit similar, it is very broken on all the best Mac builds. So let's start with Femur. The reason it's very strong with Femur is not some. I'll get to the other builds, but specifically for Femur is the fact that it allows your incense to start looping your femur easier. That extra
Mm-hmm.
2 second cutoff can be the difference between your femur feeling like a sluggish weapon that doesn't quite, infinitely charge to just going like um, a machine gun essentially. And
Mm-hmm.
this is what applies to almost every use case for library, and is probably the most obvious thing it does. It lowers your start time. It makes you
Yeah.
start the game earlier. This is why it's super strong with the potions, why it's super strong with calc. It
Mm-hmm.
makes you start the game 2 seconds earlier on a diamond than you should have, which is, especially since they bonked all items and such, a very, very broken effect. And then the third thing is on the potion builds, it also kind of makes the breakpoints for reloading potions better. So certain,
Yeah.
I don't know how to put it, but basically on the potion builds, it kind of also creates this kind of almost infinite loop scenario with certain combos. So it just
Like
it
I've
enables
had
so much stuff.
scenarios where like I ran like library with lab and a diamond invincibility potion. And I think my invincibility potion had somewhere between 60 and 80% uptime,
Yes.
which meant that flat out, most of the time I was undamageable. It means that even if my opponent had like fiery rebirth and a radiant fast charging with ammo boulder, they were unfavored, like because they can't damage me because I get to loop my items. And this is, mind you, like before laboratory used to self charge. So if you had laboratory library, it just went infinite instantly. You just
Yes.
never stopped
All right.
firing.
So that is library. Let's move on to Philosopher's Stone, which is probably the item that is, how should we put it? It's maybe the single most clickable Mac item in the game currently, because of course we
I
love clicking
also
library.
think like it's so we talked about region breakpoints, right? Where region becomes really powerful in the early game when you hit like, you know,
Or
3
three.
or
Yeah.
4. If you find 1B1 B2 on your Philosopher's Stone, and then you just use the catalyst that it gave you when you bought it,
Yes.
it's now 5 on a 5-second cooldown,
Yes.
which just solos, like even weapon Vanessas on day one,
Yes.
will solo lose to if you have Philosopher's Stone and nothing else on your board. You can
With a
probably like,
reagent, it pays for itself, but then it
yeah,
also happens to be an item that single-handedly enables or can be the win condition of numerous builds. It is, for being a bronze starting item, I struggle to think, specifically small. Of course, there's stuff like Power Drill, and there are other bronze items, even Crow's Nest, that are disproportionately efficient all throughout the game. But small
yeah.
bronze items, I cannot think of another that wears as many hats and scales as well as this one does currently. I think
It's
this
also
might
like
be the strongest bronze small item in the game currently, or
it
the
might even, I think it's stronger than a lot of items that aren't bronze or small either, because like we are hours into the patch. I've already seen people with 5-digit region on Mac.
yes,
Like you can get it, and I think we'll have to say that build in question. Like shout out to Kev from Sixton's Discord. He was actually running Moose-less Ritual Dagger with just the Essence Overload skill that turns your region into damage, because now your Philosopher's Stone is like it does everything. Like every
Yeah.
time it goes off, you multiply the damage of a weapon that benefits exponentially from increased damage. And like,
Yes. It's like Orange Julian if it was a good item, except not just a good
yeah.
item, a broken item.
And
So,
the thing is too, right? Like regen can out sustain burn if you just have twice the regen of the burn in question. And
mhm.
if you can early on get hundreds and hundreds of regen, it's hard to apply that much burn. This might be the first time in the game where regen has had at least a theoretical possibility of outpacing
Yes,
burn.
and of course it doesn't scale in game itself. Like when you play it on the board, it stays the same rate. However, there is an item called Bottle Tornado. So I'm wondering if it turns out that we're living in a Philosopher's Stone on the board day two meta, to counter opponents that have some form of in combat scaling, we start putting this on the board. Just
No, like
you
I
don't think so?
definitely do
Okay,
think for me the big
okay,
thing
okay.
is you just play Philosopher's Stone on every board in every build
Sure.
because if you can always get it to be sufficiently ahead of the curve, it just means that now you don't need any other defenses. This is
Okay.
like if you get it to 20, 30, for example, like 30 isn't that crazy of a number. It
Sure.
means that in a 5-second fight, that's equivalent to your gold chocolates.
Yeah.
In a 10-second fight, that's equivalent to 2 sets of gold chocolates, which is usually
But
enough to feel really
aren't you afraid to
powerful on
lose to
meta.
like a burn opponent who just keeps stacking burn on you and eventually burns you down? That's why I'm telling you, like,
No,
maybe
so
bottle
that's why
tornadoes don't
no, that's
squat.
why I would
Okay, okay.
never ever play it with Bottle Tornado. Why am I
Okay.
not just playing it with candles?
Okay,
I'm
fair
the
enough.
one stacking the burn, but I
Okay.
have burn and regen, and no other character can get both burn and regen, so
Fair
I'll
enough, fair
just
enough.
beat everything.
This was my sneaky way of getting this a bit higher for the
Yeah,
final screenshot.
you're
Okay, then we have
trying
Calc.
to get that one out.
Calcinator,
Because
what can
like
you say about it? It
yeah,
was max
imagine
gone.
what the boards are gonna look like now if you just play Calc Philosopher on board.
Yes.
Like
This
I
was
think it's really noteworthy on Calcinator as well. So now when you buy the Stone, it doesn't give you a chunk of lead anymore. It gives you a catalyst.
yes.
And um, you need exactly 2 transforms to get a silver or to get any tier of calcinator, I think start stacking at 2 transforms.
Yes, that
Um,
is correct.
which means that the fact that you can now potentially get 2 transforms as early as day one and very reliably by day two, it means that this calcinator is almost always going to be stacking burn
Yes.
starting day two and forward.
It gains 4 burn every time, so the second transform gives it 14, which is just about above the breakpoint there. So,
Yes.
Calcinator was already arguably tied with Distillery, or however you want to put it. It's one of Mac's best items. It got giga buffed directly from the fact that we now have a much easier time transforming reagents, which was
Yeah, because
the Achilles heel.
before it kind of wore 2 hats where you
Yes.
loved to buy it. It was we already had it in the highest tier
Yes.
because it's the best economy item in the entire game on
Yes.
any class. Like I would take this over Deed any day of the week because it's so much less conditional. It basically just says, "Hey, you have +10 income ish."
Yes.
But now and before it was like it does that always and that's really nice, and then in some amount of the games you find distillery or you're just really lucky with your transforms and you transform enough to get it to a position where like especially if you get fiery on it it's a compelling carry item. Now, I think most of the time you'll be able to do that, and it's a bronze medium on a character that doesn't have that many bronze mediums. Any day one, day two mythal is like a really easy way of just finding Calcinator.
Agreed. And it's also just the strongest Mac build already. Like we already agreed before this patch came out that Calcinator is the best way, just the best, not just the best
Yeah,
economy or
because
whatever. It's just the best build.
and it's not
So
like the strongest build, in the sense of like it doesn't have the highest ceiling out of any Mac build. But the thing that makes it so good is because the way that Calcinator functions as an item, where it's just a really big stick of burn, the fact that Mac has so many different ways of rewarding having a big stick of burn. It's good with strength potion, it's good with smelling salts, it's good with fire claw, it's good with, any kind of haste, any kind of cooldown reduction. It's great with library,
And
it's
it has
amazing
amazing
with
enchants
pendulum, with
also.
scales, amazing
Yes.
enchants. Like the thing that makes it the quote unquote best build, even if it isn't the strongest build, is that it's so broadly applicable that if you have Calcinator, that's the only criteria to more or less guarantee that come the end of the game, you will have a board that makes sense and is compelling. That's the only
Also,
thing you needed to
two
do is
more
just find the
things.
Calcinator.
Because it is also the best economy engine,
Yeah.
Calcinator is the Mac build that is by far, and it's not even close, the easiest build to pivot out of. And
Yeah, it's so
so,
crazy. It has
yes,
like, I think it's maybe the only build in the entire game and in the entire. No, okay. So it's the only non-pig build that has negative opportunity cost, because you can do a similar thing with a lot of value stacking pig
sure,
builds where it's
yes,
like the value also turns into your pivot funds. But
yes.
it's exactly as you say, since the bill generates net positive money, it's a negative opportunity cost, because
Yes.
by hedging the build, you gained more opportunities to go other builds
No,
than
no,
if you
but it's
hadn't
even
been
better
hedging
or
this build
worse.
to
It
begin
is
with.
such as the package you need is so small that it's not just that the fact that you have gold, you also have space, because all you need when you play
Yes,
a
yes.
calc these days is just the calc itself. And now comes the final point. When you transition, like that awkward stage where you go from a very strong calc build to a decently strong femur build, you can still have the damn calc on the board. You can still have
Yeah.
80 extra burn on your stupid board for 2 board slots. So there isn't even this awkward, oh, am I making myself weaker or stronger by pivoting? No, there is this build is just ridiculously strong in like every metric. Like it's inventing new metrics of
Yes.
being strong essentially. Like we have to invent
Yeah.
new categories for this specific build.
And
So
because again, like to be absolutely when we say strong, we are not referring to the fact that there aren't builds that theoretically beat
yes.
Calcinator. It's still relatively slow, and if you have library, there are tons of other things that'll be equally strong to the Calcinator. So it's not that hard to beat, but the fact that it's good enough to reliably get 10 wins, and obviously this is a little bit theoretical, we've only seen the items, but it's because of how easy it was before and the fact that it unquestionably got significantly easier. It means that we can say with relative certainty that when the thing we already considered to have a low barrier to entry got a much lower barrier to entry, it stands to reason that it probably has an insanely low barrier to entry now. The fact that you can have a build that's decent enough to get to 10 wins, where you can find the only criteria you need to commit to the build on day one, node one in your first shop, and it costs you 4 gold, is like kind of that's what we mean when we say that's strong. Like, imagine if you're playing any other character in the game and day one, node one, shop one, that you have really high odds of this is just a 10 win run now. I don't think you can say that for anything else.
The only time in history that happened before was in the last patch, like 2 patches ago on Dually. If I got cold defense grid as my starting skill, that was before node 1, that was node 0. I knew
Yeah,
as
and
soon as
like
that force
even
field shows
then,
up.
it's like
Sure, sure, I'm
I
just saying.
think most people would consider that like far harder to
Yes.
pilot, and that it has like more
Yeah, oh, that's true. Yeah, okay,
vulnerabilities, and
that's
it's
true.
not like negative. opportunity cost. And
Fair
even
enough.
then, like I think most people would have considered that a bit ridiculous, and this is like that tenfold.
Yeah, yeah, no, this is
Except
stronger. I'm just saying,
yeah,
I have
except like it's
experienced this
the
feeling
fact that
before.
you don't, it's not a one shot at rolling it either.
No, no, it's
It's
true.
just every time you walk into a shop that's legally allowed to sell you a bronze medium, you might just be, oh,
Yes,
okay, I'm done now. I have my 10
yes.
wins.
All right, and then finally we have distillery, which is
Yeah.
distillery. It's ridiculous. It is on its own enabling so many archetypes. Like distillery on its own, is just
Yes.
an item you slam on the board with potions, and you're very happy, and you want to upgrade it.
Mm-hmm.
It's without any of the meta gaming stuff it does for you. It's just a
Yeah.
useful item. On top of that, it's the bar none best bang for your buck in terms of transforms per node. Essentially, it gives you the
Yeah,
most
and then
transforms per
on
day.
top of that, it also lets you, so most of Mac's utility pieces are potions,
Yes.
which means that if you have distillery, you can choose to scale one of the transform scaling items. You can choose to go for getting the maximum amount of money. And you can also choose to just have vastly superior shop quality by just re-rolling a thing that has the tier that you want to find a specific thing at. And it also goes on your board as a potent enabler. It truly is the like jack of all trades and also master of all of those
Yes.
trades.
Yes. So there you have it. This is Mac in a nutshell, a very long and elaborate even nutshell.
Yes.
Um, but there you have it,
Artisanal
guys.
nutshell.
Uh, and if you have any questions, if there are items you feel we should have elaborated on, we were wrong on, you feel that why didn't you guys talk about Frozen Flame? Why didn't you talk about Memento Mori? Don't you worry. It's because we haven't played them enough. It's that simple. We are humans. We only have so many hours a day to play
Yeah.
Mac, and we would rather play the calc than try and make the cauldron
As
work.
as with all tier lists, there's a large degree of like subjective opinion in
Yes,
it, and I
and
think
blind
I
spots.
actually love this part about the bazaar. Like, I really undervalued Magic Carpet because I'd seen Magic Carpet and I understood the concept behind Magic Carpet, but I hadn't tried to like force my way into that build because I just wasn't sure if the payoff was worth it. And a really good player like Rarish comes along and convinces me, no, it's totally, absolutely worth it. You try it, you go, oh shit, that worked so well. Now you have a whole new line that you go in more games. And I think that's like the cool thing about the game, right? Is that it's so complex and deep that there are these blind spots just because no one has enough time in the day to play everything.
Yes. So thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you Metla for being here. You can take this opportunity to plug your own channel or where we can find you.
Yeah, I'm very grateful you had me on. I'm Metallfenix with two L's and an F on both Twitch and YouTube. I've been kind of strong arming my way into the guide niche lately. I have both a guide on how to play the early game with Mac, which I think largely stays the same even after this update. The only difference is that now you also value picking up things that give you catalysts, but that's a very small adjustment to make. And I have a Mac overview video as well that talks much more broadly about like, okay, so how do all of these items connect with each other? I actually think these are great complements to each other because the overview gives you a much more abstract idea, whereas this tier list kind of serves to give you a much more practical guide towards, okay, so what does this mean I actually want to be doing within a run? So anyone who wants to know more about Mac, I'd strongly recommend checking out both things and they'll work great together.
Yes. So I will be linking both those videos as well as Metal Phoenix channel in the description. So make sure to check them out. And yeah, I'll be back with more tier lists, more build rankings, and meta snapshots in the future. So see you guys in the next video. Bye bye.